This is the Open University.
"'Tis the season of mists and mellow fruitfulness." And that's why I'm staying in and I'm making music, because normally I'm lured out just by some kind of obligation to be present in the day, to drink coffee of quality in cafes recommended by Google Maps, at least to 69% level, and to people watch and to meet up with interesting folks who live in the city where I happen to be at the time. Currently Berlin, but I'll be in Paris from next week, and who knows where after that, maybe traveling again. So this was my last chance in a way to not just to make these talking videos, these Open University videos, but also to make a little bit of music, which was sort of unexpected, because I don't really have a record planned, but I wanted to do a sort of EP. It's not monetized in any way, it's a sort of jeu d'esprit, a kind of just a thing for me to do to keep myself occupied. I was getting a little bored towards the end of the doldrums of summer. But I was thinking recently about all these stories in the press about people making a fortune from NFTs. I should sell the NFT rights to these. I shouldn't actually release them as a record at all, but just say you can have a digital certificate on the blockchain to show that you own these new songs. That'd be interesting. Ownership is something I've never really been very keen on, though. I'm more in the folk tradition of trad and communal ownership, a kind of collectivist approach to songwriting, which is my way of, a nice way of saying I'm a pirate marauding in the shark-infested waters of a kind of grey area of, copyright, non-copyright, pre- and post-copyright, as I used to like to put it. Pre-copyright was the folk tradition of anon and trad and nobody quite being the author of the song. Post-copyright was the sort of internet period where there was a free-for-all, it seemed, in the early years of this century, where copyright seemed to be dead, before the kind of reassertion. But then who knows how long this reassertion will last. The sort of era now where on YouTube you get a lot of copyright strikes for pretty much anything. I get copyright strikes for putting my own videos of my own music, online, as soon as they've been published. So these songs are, at the moment, there's no plan for them to be published or to be released in physical formats or even streamed on the streaming platforms. As I say, they're simply a jeu d'esprit. And I wanted to talk a little bit about their origin, which was actually very specific, because although there might seem to be a lot of eclectic kind of styles going on, there isn't the usual accordion, the drone accordion or the systems music accordion, which I've embraced for the last couple of albums, isn't present. It's more a synthy sound. And that's because I watched this amazing video posted by a guy called Heinbach called The Forgotten Synthesizers of the Marsh Region. And the Marsh Region, it's in Italian it's called Marchigiano. And so this whole video, it's like 40 minutes long, and it's mostly focusing on the Museo del Synth Marchigiano, which is located in Macerata. It's quite a small town, about 130 kilometers north of Pescara, where I was last year, 45 kilometers south of Ancona. Ancona and Pescara are both port towns on the Adriatic Sea, on the east coast of Italy. So it's kind of, the Rimini disco and all the rest of it, but also it's very Italian in the sense that there were a lot of, just as there are a lot of little, sports car manufacturers or leather goods manufacturers, some of which go on to be, world famous brand names, and many of which don't. Almost artisanal, kind of crafts level cottage industry. The same thing happened in this Macerata region with synthesizers. They had a lot of people making accordions and organs. The Italians had this huge variety of really amazing organs, often with these amazing little beatboxes built in. So a lot of the Momus sound, really, actually, if you come down to it, it's a very Italian synthy sound, beatboxy sound. You'd think of electronics being Japanese or Asian or kind of global and not really rooted anywhere, but there are these really rooted electronics industries which are very small companies making synths which are now forgotten. So this video was really fascinating to me. It's very well done. basically one of the guys running the museum, Riccardo Pietroni, was demonstrating the synths, and I was really taken by some of these little demonstrations. So I think you'll hear that actually the songs are based in me sampling him playing, just dropping his fingers fairly randomly onto the keyboards to demonstrate the sounds of these amazing old synths. Let's get a bit of context here. Here's what turned into the first song, the Orchestras song.
One of the first arranger, they take the part of the drum machine of the organ and put in a single keyboard.
So it's just before.
Arranger. One of the first arranger.
So that's a kind of electronic reggae, or I don't know. It's a pattern built into this CRB Computer Band 2000. 2000, obviously, it was probably current in about 1980, and you can hear that it's like a combination of a synth and a home organ. It's got this sort of accompaniment auto pattern built into it. Something I've used an awful lot down here. I've got a box full of electronic gadgets here, which includes some of the things which have provided the characteristic sound of, for instance, my ping pong album. 1997 was based almost entirely on this machine, so the Roland PMA5, and not just its built-in sounds. This was something Scanner showed me. I went to a Scanner show in the meatpacking district in New York in about 1996, and he had one of these, a really early Roland PMA5 personal music assistant, and it had these are auto accompaniment patterns in various styles programmed by the Japanese engineers according to their idea of what a polka arrangement was or what a funk arrangement was. So if you listen to songs like My Pervert Doppelganger, you'll hear the way that begins, that sort of dun 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 dun. There's a little pattern there, which is it's a purely pre-programmed pattern built into the Roland PMA5. And so I was mixing that with my own sounds, but getting a lot of the arrangement ideas on those 1997 songs from this gadget. And it's something I've always done, because although it seems like a kind of callous, craven and uncreative thing to do, to use pre-programmed sounds like that, you've got to remember that they'll only be current for a while, and that they will actually sound more original and unique. And also that not many people use those things, because they do seem to be terribly naff. People with home organs, it's the kind of thing you would have found in the 70s in someone's house, because their dad played the home organ and used the rhythm box in it. But actually the rhythm box had amazing cool sounds in it, like a maestro type sound. I love all that. And I love when variété, basically variety styles, are programmed into those machines. So it's not a rock and roll machine, it's an electronic variety. So you get this funny collision of the electronic culture of video games and Nintendo Game Boys. I'm sure I've got a few of those in here along with my stylophones and things. But it's also the kind of cabaret or variety of kind of the music hall and vaudeville traditions. So that's very much where I am. I'm an electronic artist who reaches back into the vaudeville tradition of comedy songs and narrative songs, and so I love to collide those two things. So this has got an oompa, kind of almost a Eurovision Song Contest kind of dum dum. What he's playing here, what the rhythm box is making him play. It's almost got a puppet on a string kind of thing with the oompa. I think of I wonder if one day that you'll say that. Okay, Sandy Shaw singing Puppet on a String in 1967. That's where I tune into pop music. Cliff Richard singing The Day I Met Marie with Her Dancing Eyes. It's kind of naff, middle-of-the-road variety, and yet there's often an edge of strangeness to it, especially when I rewrite it. So I rewrote this one as orchestras. These orchestras are dead, and of course a dead orchestra, that's the literal translation of the term karaoke. So a lot of this music is a bit like karaoke music. It's kind of an auto accompaniment. You press a button and it will do something, like a whole something like an electronic approximation of what an arranger would do with a song for karaoke purposes, really. So I'm, and in my song Orchestras, it's really, these orchestras are dead. It's kind of a response to what's been happening in my chosen medium of expression, which is pop music. It seems to have died, and it's almost like big rock, the same way that lawsuits and court cases brought down, big tobacco and are threatening, all sorts of other big, liable kind of entities which go out of fashion because they suddenly seem to be detrimental to the health of normal people. Rock music has almost become one of those dinosaur industries like big oil as well. Because you get Bob Dylan being attacked as a kind of figurehead currently in a legal dispute and a series of serious allegations against Bob Dylan. At the same time, you get the Nirvana cover sleeve for Nevermind. The baby on that cover is suing the photographers for not having given his permission, or never having been signed permission from his parents, and him having his life ruined apparently by appearing as this naked baby on the, having been bullied as a result of that, and so on and so on. So it's almost like there's a climate where, and of course all these people dying, like Charlie Watts dying, it's just all these things happened in like 1 week, and I just thought, God, well, this orchestra is dead. This really is also, I guess there's a reference to Malcolm McLaren's very interesting idea of karaoke culture, where he said that we were now just going through the motions of what had been at one point presumably an authentic, rebellious subculture. As soon as it goes mainstream and just becomes a kind of, people miming. I think there's some awful movie about the Sex Pistols coming out as well, where the Sex Pistols are all being played by these posh actors, and all that sense of, their style and their rebellion has really vanished. So it's a kind of, or even Oasis being a karaoke version of the Beatles. So karaoke culture was for me, a very compelling metaphor which McLaren came up with in the 90s. So the idea of a dead orchestra, a karaoke version of pop music, staggering on in a zombie-like way, but not really being relevant anymore. These orchestras are dead. And then the chorus of my song Orchestras is, but this rush for inequality was never clean in the first place. I mean, I've been obviously in the belly of the beast, and I've been very skeptical of its values, especially rock values. I was really part of an anti-rockist movement which started as a bit tongue-in-cheek in the early 80s. People like Simon Reynolds and the writers Penman and Morley at the NME were attacking rock from within. Rock Against Racism, which actually was sort of spawned from disgust at David Bowie's stance on Hitler and the Thin White Duke and all the rest of it. And although ironically later David Bowie was seen in Tin Machine sporting a Rock Against Racism t-shirt and taking some very strong anti-racist stances with MTV, for instance, saying they weren't playing enough black artists. But the Rock Against Racism was sort of flipped around by clever journalists into a race against rockism, which was initially just a joke, but then it became quite a serious thing. That rockism became an ideology of authenticity and of dullness, against which you could juxtapose artificiality and the synthetic as something exciting. And I rushed to that side of the synthetic. That was my set of values. That nothing was needed to be authentic, You didn't have to really have lived the pain. So anyway, I was talking about this. I got 2 songs out of the same video, The Forgotten Synthesizers of the Marsh Region. And the second one is the second song which was composed, which is Bergreise, Journey to the Mountains, literally. And that's when the same guy, Riccardo Pietroni, is demonstrating the Krumar DS2, which has got some wonderful rising sine waves through it. It comes about 20 minutes into this video.
One of the
So you can hear quite a lot of the song is already there. It's I just sort of chopped that and put it in a more regular rhythm. Of course, I have my own analog synth here, which is a Korg Mono Poly. And it's it's kind of set up for bass and stuff at the moment. But it's if I click the poly button here, you can see that it's doing an attempt at polyphony, but it's really an analog synth. But I'm kind of more interested in sampling synths. So Bergreise as a song, it's in German, which is it's not a first for me because I did a really awful Google translated German song, Little Schubert it was called, which was on my Oscar Tennis Champion record in 2002. But it was deliberately very bad German, and what I always do is I'm interested, in the same way I'm interested in electronic versions of beatboxes and arrangements, an electronic take on an acoustic arrangement is more interesting to me than the original acoustic arrangement. So the bad translation of any given epoch is sort of more interesting to me. The Oki Milk album, a lot of it is drawn from terribly bad Google translations of Japanese, actually the diary of Rinko Kawachi, the photographer, whose work I really loved, and she was keeping an online diary at one point, but Japanese auto-translation was almost unusably bad at the time. It's much, much better now, very good now. And I kind of liked the inaccuracy of the translation because it produced a kind of nonsense poetry. Scorch of stripes in the pines, all that stuff. There was some beautiful kind of imagery that came out, a bit like chopping up in the Burroughs technique, chopping up. You would get a kind of chopped up, a pre-chopped bad translation. So this time I used much better Google German translation, but it still sounded stilted to German ears, according to some of the responses I got online in social media. German speakers saying, there's no actual errors in this, but it's not how a German person would speak. So it was a little bit obviously inspired by one of my favorite Holger Hiller songs, which is Oben im Eck, which he also, interestingly enough, when he described, I interviewed him specifically about that one song.
Ein Fleck oben im Eck. That was what my association was of how I heard this. If it would have been a composer, how the melody would go, or what the backdrop of the chords would be. Now, when we recorded this, and the melody was there, we then arranged it like a completely gewöhnlich, a normal kind of...
Right, a willed composition, a kind of
as if it was a completely
yeah.
consciously...
Yeah, so the random element stopped at that point, yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And that was the idea. By arranging it like a pop arrangement, you would give the impression that this was actually a composition.
He described how his fingers had simply fallen randomly onto the Emulator 2 keyboard, which he was using at the time. That was his instrument. That's the really stilted but very aggressive avant-garde classical sounds that he was sampling at the time. In terms of Oben im Eck, it's very austere, and it uses a harp sound, and it's got Billy Mackenzie's voice in it singing abstract notes, and it's remarkably austere. My song, apparently inspired by it, doesn't really have the same austerity. It's very lush with a lot of overlapping synth chords and seventh chords and things like that. It's my style, which is a bit different. I would love to have that austerity, to make a very austere record. And I think if I have a doubt about these three songs, it would be that they're a little bit all over the place stylistically, especially the third one, which got this galloping bass line, a bit like the kind I used to use for Hairstyle of the Devil, Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous back in the late 80s. Sort of Pet Shop Boys, New Order-ish kind of sound, where you're using French song structures often, with cycles of fifths and things like that, but you're also using a kind of electronic language coming from disco and from Sylvester's You Make Me Feel Mighty Real and all the rest of it. So I did a remix of that third song, the Hydra, in a very disco style, a very Nile Rodgers kind of late 70s style as well. But I'm not entirely sure about that song. But it's the idea of making a record that's not going to be a record, just sort of experimenting, is really that you can be stylistically impure. I think if I were setting out on an album, I would try to, there'd be more of a Dogma 95 kind of approach. This was the cinema movement in which people swore off things like using studio lighting or certain kinds of, any kind of video trickery or anything like that, to make pure and in some sense puritanical cinema. And I think when you're making a record, I often start off with a series of rules that I'm going to be pure. I'm only going to use accordion plus, organize everything around that. But often it's breaking the rules, which is the interesting bit. Once you've set that kind of agenda, you can feel kind of deliciously naughty breaking the rules you've set for yourself. But the rules will still define. Style is restriction. And I think this is really important when you're talking about early synthesizers. Style is restriction. They couldn't do as much as today's keyboards. And the thing about today's software is that you can do pretty much anything. Eno always had this thing about, he hated when keyboard players in a studio would start scrolling through sounds, trying a particular part with all these different sounds, and he thought that was the most uncreative and also boring use of time possible. So he would try to restrict himself to one instrument. He really got into just playing the guitar. He's currently more into choral singing, choirs, singing with the human voice, or programming his DX7 synthesizer. The first song, of course, the Bergreiser song, it's kind of partly influenced by Ludwig Holl, who had this novel called Bergfahrt, Trip to the Mountains, but also in the Matrix of the Oberheim is the first line, and it's really the idea that synthesizers often, Italian though they may be in their origin, they often have this Germanic sounds to them. You get the Oberheim, the Nordheim lead, the Steinberg or whatever it's called. They often have the sound of German mountains. So in the matrix of the Oberheim, it's because there used to be, when I would go into studios, when I was back in the days when one would have to record in studios, there'd often be an Oberheim matrix or a Jupiter 8 or whatever it would be there on the racks, and you could use these. You could never really own them. I could personally never own them. I did own one Italian synthesizer in the late, when I became affluent in the 90s, one of the things I did was I bought a lot of theremins and retro analog synths. So I had a Gen, which is a very nice little Italian monophonic synthesizer, and if you saw me on tour in the US in the late 90s, I was probably playing my Gen. We had two synths with it. I think we had the Korg Monopoly with us, and we had the Gen, which is very portable and compact. So that was from one of these little companies which no longer exists, one of these little Italian synth companies. I love Italian technology, especially retro Italian technology, but I also love the kind of way that Italian music is a mixture of the kind of French chanson tradition and the European variety traditions, almost a bit of Schlager in there. You could even say the sort of papa bass line on the first track, the Orchestras track, is a little bit Schlager. That's my last thought for today, and thank you for listening.
Open University.